I like to start by acknowledging that there is no shortage of opinions on food and migraine, and I'm sure you've heard something on the subject and someone making a recommendation or telling you, what to try for migraine. So I think it's important to share a little bit about me and my perspective on the subject, so you know where my recommendations are coming from. And hopefully, I hope you'll listen to me or trust the information. So I share about my credentials and what may, bias my opinion. And I think we all have biases. And so it's important to recognize those up front and move forward with that information. So as Deidre said, I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. The RDNs are the credentialed nutrition professionals in the healthcare setting in the US. I believe it's the same in Ireland. So we work as part of the team of allied health professionals alongside nurses and doctors and physical therapists and you name it, in the clinical healthcare setting, so hospitals, long-term care facilities, and so forth. What's a little different is I'm also a PhD trained food scientist, and so I specialized in my training in really understanding food composition and how to measure what's in food. So I do know food down to a molecular level and what's in it. And so combine that with the fact that I do have migraine, and I share that not necessarily because it's a prerequisite for giving this talk or sharing this research, but so that hopefully know that I empathize and can understand what some of this is coming from. And that definitely does influence how I take in the data and how I think about making recommendations. But so I didn't set out to become a migraine researcher when I started studying food. I started studying it because I loved chemistry and food. But when I combined all of this knowledge together and started looking at what to do for myself, I realized the lack of evidence in making good recommendations for nutrition. And so I set out, I was motivated to become a migraine researcher. And so here I am a handful of years later doing research in this space. So I've published in peer-reviewed journals like Headache and Nutritional Neuroscience, the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And I've presented research at a number of different scientific societies, including the American Headache Society. And so I hope that really emphasizes that I come at this topic from an evidence-based approach, and I hope you'll see that woven throughout the presentation. In order to do scientific research, we need funding. So these are the places where I disclose where I've received funding. They've given me money to do research. There's nothing in direct conflict with what I'm presenting today, but again, I find it helpful just to share. Again, it's mostly, food-based research. This is not all necessarily migraine-related work. I'll also share the disclaimer and kind of re-emphasize that this is not intended to be medical advice. Please talk with your doctor, your healthcare provider, your dietitian, about your specific situation, your diagnosis and treatment needs, about what you hear at this session. So here are the questions for the day. So we have, we'll be talking about overall eating patterns and how they may influence migraine outcomes. So there's a lot of talk about triggers and migraine and what foods may trigger an attack. So I like to start out with, what are the eating patterns that may help us prevent migraine attacks, in the same way you would think about trying to eat a certain way to mitigate the effects of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. I think the evidence is increasing to show us that we can do something similar for migraine. We'll talk about skipping meals and fasting and what that has to do with migraine attacks. We can talk a little bit about food triggers. I really don't emphasize it too much. We'll talk about supplements just a little again, and then how long we need to follow a diet to see if it's working for you. And all of this, another caveat that this is related to adults. There is some evidence for kids, but we just don't have time to get into that tonight. So the other caveat I want to mention, and I don't have text on the slide for this, but I think you've heard my introduction and my accent. I'm in the United States. Science crosses borders and oceans rather easily. So the underlying physiology will change, just by crossing the ocean to get to you guys. But the food supply and the healthcare system are certainly different. And so I'll do my best to adjust, and your Migraine Ireland team has helped me to get a quick understanding of your healthcare system and what's going on there as it relates to migraine. But I do ask for your grace when if I don't get something quite right. But please, if there's something that's lingering with you, ask me your questions at the end, and I'll be happy to do my best. And then the other thing I like to mention is that I do think, as I will present, I do think diet and nutrition can be part of the answer for migraine. I do not think it is the answer for migraine. I think this is something to put into your toolbox alongside all of the other treatments that are out there for migraine with great evidence. So I don't want you to leave this presentation thinking that diet is the only thing you have to do. Definitely you'll be following up with your healthcare provider, neurologist, whoever, whatever your healthcare team is. They've got other evidence-based treatments for you that will help. And I think it's this collection of treatments that will help with migraine. So if I thought diet would cure everything, I would quit my job and I'd be out there helping everybody to do just that. I think we need more answers, which is why I'm still doing research to try to figure out what we can achieve with diet and migraine. Another thing to kind of keep things in perspective before we jump into the science more so is that the landscape of nutritional evidence for migraine is changing. More evidence is coming in. There are a lot of research groups around the world on multiple different continents working on this relationship between understanding nutrition and diet and migraine. And that's a great thing. But there are still a lot of nuances in how we interpret the results, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And the more things we answer, the more questions we get. So your patience is still needed. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism, and you'll hear me repeat that over and over, and I really do believe that. But there's still a lot we don't know. So we're kind of in this, in between space right now. And especially when we get to the Q&A at the end, you will have amazing questions that I won't have answers for. So I'll have to admit that when it comes up and ask for your patience. But again, lots of reason to be optimistic with new evidence coming in. The other thing I want to say about evidence is this, and it is observing when any of us in the healthcare world observe kind of this balance, and whenever we make a recommendation for a patient, it's, we weigh the burden and the risk of any particular treatment against the evidence for that treatment being beneficial to any particular patient's needs. And so it's really that balance that the evidence has to outweigh the burden or the risk in order it to be, a good choice in most cases. And so I want to acknowledge that I don't think, when we're thinking specifically about diet changes and diet interventions for migraine, I don't know that we've always gotten this balance completely correct. A lot of dietary changes that we make take a lot of effort. It's a day-to-day. It takes longer to go to the grocery store and read all the labels. It takes longer when you go to a restaurant you've gone to a number of times, and now you've got to read the menu more closely because you're trying to make a specific change. This is the burden. This is real. And I think we've sort of thrown around recommendations in the past of dietary modifications without the necessary evidence and support. And so I think this balance has gotten a little, was maybe not what we would want it to be. And so I want to mention that this is something that I see, and this is something that I weigh really heavily as I think about what to recommend for diet and migraine. So anyway, that's my perspective. So here's the last thing before we really dive in to the migraine stuff. I want to recognize that this dietary migraine research is happening and advancing at the same time as we've seen and have been seeing, and I think we're sort of at the end of seeing the shift in the nutrition science community, where nutrition recommendations a decade or more ago were really focused on individual nutrients. Saturated fat, sodium, calcium, bones. And so not that the science doesn't support those as being important recommendations biologically, It just doesn't connect to nutritional recommendations and guidelines for how we actually eat. We eat foods, not nutrients. We eat foods in combination as meals. We eat meals with people, with our friends, with our family. And so the nutrition guidelines have been evolving, not just here in the States. The slide shows a picture from Canada, but elsewhere in the world too. Looking at overall eating patterns and recognizing that if we can get the overall pattern right, we can fix a lot of those individual nutrient shifts along the way. And so the guidelines here from Canada, I love this picture, is what is recommended in a lot of official capacity in a lot of places around the world these days, which is eating, whenever you eat, if you can, fill half your plate with vegetables and fruits. And then when you're eating grains, choose whole grains. And when you're eating proteins, choose lean proteins. And for beverages, try to choose unsweetened beverages. And so it's sort of, if you can follow that overall guideline, you don't need as much of the rest of the presentation. But if you can follow that overall guideline, you're well on your way to kind of having nutrients and balance. And so that's where the nutrition community is these days, and trying to reach people with recommendations that we can actually follow in the real world. So let's talk and jump in about eating patterns and kind of this overall pattern approach and what's been studied for migraine. So if we look at the nutritional interventions that have been studied for migraine, and when I say nutritional intervention, I'm saying these are the studies that have sort of assigned people to follow some particular diet and observed migraine outcomes after a period of time. So they observe how many migraines or how severe the migraines are before someone follows the diet. They follow the diet for a couple months, and then they measure the migraine again at the end. And a number of different diets have been tested in this way. And you can see some of them on the slide here, ranging from low glycemic, low lipid, the healthy eating plate, which is akin to the figure I just showed on the previous slide, the ketogenic diet, and a number of others. And I'm sure I've missed some on this slide. And the interesting thing is that most of the interventions that have been studied in this way have had a positive effect on improving migraine outcomes. And so that's great news on one hand. And you may be wondering, the question I've got, kind of in bold here is, if that's true, why aren't we seeing more recommendations for nutrition and migraine? Why aren't people shouting this from the rooftops that we've got something great here? And the reason is, what's underlined here is that if we strictly evaluate these studies and we look at them really critically as scientists, it's mostly considered low quality evidence. And what this means out in, in the real world is that how the studies were designed, it's difficult to isolate the effect of diet on migraine. So it's possible that something else is happening in the course of the study that might explain the improvement in migraine. And one of the common things that happens in dietary studies is that it's difficult to blind people to what dietary intervention they're receiving. They know if they're doing the ketogenic diet, there's really no way to blind people to that. And that results in a lower scientific grading of the study overall. So it's possible that is happening. It's possible that there's a placebo effect, that if people think they're following a diet, then they might improve because of that result. And the placebo effect is very real and very prominent in a lot of pain research. And so it's something that researchers are very attuned to. So there are reasons to be skeptical of this data, but I don't want to lose sight, and I don't want to be too negative on this. This is part of the scientific process. We are learning from these studies. We are learning how to conduct better ones, and specifically for migraine as it relates to diet, and we're making advances. So again, there are reasons to be optimistic, even when you see words like low quality evidence. But I also don't want you to put too much stock in just any study that's out there, any single one study that's out there for diet and migraine. We usually like to see a few studies, a few clinical trials start to pile up with similar evidence before we start to make recommendations. So let's talk about a few of the eating patterns that I think have the best evidence for reducing migraine. I've got 3 eating patterns that we'll talk about next. And each will follow kind of this overall flow. So what is the diet? What's the evidence? Who might benefit from following this specific diet or this specific eating pattern? How long do we need to follow it to see results? And what does this look like in real life? If I'm out here going to the grocery store, what does that translate into? So first, the ketogenic diet. I know a lot of people have heard about this and may have questions, so let's jump in. The ketogenic diet, you may know, restricts carbohydrates to very low levels and proteins as well to kind of moderate levels. And as a result, in trying to kind of make up for the amount of energy that carbs and proteins normally contribute to the diet, you see much higher levels of fat are needed to provide adequate energy for the person in the meanwhile. The ketogenic diet was originally studied for epilepsy and showed promise and now has great evidence for reducing seizures in a subset of the population with epilepsy. And so it's also been studied in migraine as a similar episodic disease and episodic attack disease. And the reasoning behind this very specific high fat, low carb diet is that it is intended to mimic what's called a fasting state, so a state where you haven't eaten for a while. And the evidence in epilepsy originally showed that when kids were fasting, someone noticed that when kids were fasting and hadn't eaten for a while, they had less seizures. And so this diet was originally designed to try to mimic that metabolic state of fasting. And so the restriction of carbs, that really strict restriction of carbs, is because when you eat carbohydrates, enters your blood as blood glucose, the body responds by putting insulin out into the blood. And insulin is this hormone. It's sending a signal to the rest of the body saying, hey, she just ate. Get ready to receive this blood glucose, and it causes all sorts of metabolic changes. And so with the ketogenic diet, when you're really restricting carbohydrate intake, you're shifting metabolism pretty dramatically. You don't get the same insulin signals, and you don't get the same complete metabolism of fat without as much carbohydrate present as well. And your body produces ketones, hence ketogenic. Anyway, so that's the background of the ketogenic diet. So the evidence for it, there are several randomized controlled trials supporting the use of the ketogenic diet. Randomized controlled trials are generally considered our highest level, or the highest levels when you combine multiple randomized controlled trials together in what's called a meta-analysis, but it's a very high level of evidence in a randomized controlled trial. So there are several of those. They are relatively small. And not everyone completes them because the ketogenic diet is so difficult to follow. But the ones that do have evidence have shown decreases in headache days per month fairly consistently across the different studies. And so this is what has gotten some good attention for the ketogenic diet and migraine, that there is some evidence from our CTs showing some benefit. So who might benefit? Who might be most interested in this? It is a difficult diet to follow. And so it's not something for someone, if you just have migraine once in a while, it's probably not worth the entire shift in your way of eating. But for someone who has migraines 4 or more days a month, this might be something worth considering. Also, because it works with your metabolism and does have benefits for insulin sensitivity, someone who's overweight or has metabolic syndrome, which insulin resistance can be part of, as well as abdominal obesity, folks with those conditions might be interested in the ketogenic diet for its kind of other benefits alongside potential for helping migraine. And I add here, for someone who wants to do it, because because the ketogenic diet is a difficult diet, you've got to be kind of motivated to follow it and keep up with it. Interventions that have studied it have lasted between 1 and 3 months. So we've seen benefits as soon as 3 months and sometimes up to 3. So it sort of depends. I will say it does take a week or so, sometimes a little longer, to get over the initial phase of adjusting to the ketogenic diet. So the first week or so, you may not feel the best. There's sort of anecdotally called the keto flu, is that system where your body is adjusting, getting rid of all the carbohydrates you've got stored in your liver and your muscle and adjusting to this kind of different metabolism. So definitely give it more than a week or two um, to see if it's helping you. What does it look like? Very high in fat, low in carbs, moderate in protein. So if the typical diet is over here, where half the calories are coming, half the energy you're eating is coming from carbs, in orange, carbs in the classical ketogenic diet are restricted to 2% of your energy. And this vast green in the classic ketogenic diet, that original one developed for epilepsy, was looking at 90%. Versus kind of the typical Western diet where we see fat intake as about a third of energy intake. There are different versions of the ketogenic diet out there these days that allow us to maintain that state of ketosis, that altered metabolism, while not restricting carbohydrates quite so drastically. And this also complicates the evidence for migraine, because some of the studies have used different versions of the ketogenic diet to produce that altered metabolic state. So it can be hard to combine the results of different studies. The classic ketogenic diet, again, this is the most strict, but you're looking at very, very low intake of carbs, no toast with your eggs in the morning, no bread on the side with your sandwich, no pasta in your noodles for dinner, the zucchini noodles, no sweets, no cakes, and even restricting the types of fruits you eat, and so forth. So that's a sample of the ketogenic diet. So the next eating pattern I want to discuss is the high omega-3 and low omega-6 eating pattern. And so this is an eating pattern to control the intake of these two specific types of fats. They are both essential fatty acids, so we do need some of these in our diet always to stay alive and stay healthy. But the ratio where they appear in our food supply, we generally have lots of omega-6 available in our foods, especially our processed foods. And at least here in the States, we're not as good about getting our omega-3, often from fish sources. And so this diet is intended to, or this eating pattern is intended to try to reverse that, try to increase the amount of omega-3s we eat and decrease the amount of omega-6s. And the reason, the reason for people with migraine is that there are two very well-designed randomized controlled trials that show that this benefits people with migraine. And improved not only migraine days, it improved migraine days. So in people who started with 16 headache days per month, it decreased their headaches by 4 days per month, so down from 16 to 12, by making these dietary changes, which is pretty good. Not only did they look at that, but they also looked at a biomarker that they expected was specifically related to pain, and to the transmission of pain, and they saw it decrease as they were improving the migraine day outcome as well. So sort of these two corroborating pieces of evidence that what they thought would happen biologically was happening, and likely what was influencing the migraine days. Who might this particular eating pattern benefit? They studied people with 5 to 20 migraine days per month. And so that's what I have listed here to, again, rely on the evidence. However, I would say that there's evidence for other health conditions and sort of general inflammatory conditions, and general health, that eating more omega-3s than most of us typically get is a good thing, and as well as decreasing omega-6 oils and improving that ratio. And so I would say, sure, if you've got that level of migraines, there's evidence that it could benefit your migraines, but certainly you're welcome. Anyone, I think, could benefit from this if you're not already eating this way. The study lasted 16 weeks. And so that's how long, I can say from the evidence to follow it before you see a result. I will say I would expect this one to move slower, just based on the mechanisms, that I would expect this outcome to show up a little slower than the ketogenic diet. So give it some patience. And what does it look like? High fish intake, low foods with vegetable oil. So on this slide, I can show you increased foods with omega-3 intake. And so certainly we see, from various different sorts of fatty fish, especially the fatty fish, so salmon, mackerel, herring, the really high omega-3 content fish. There are some plankton and algae that have a high omega-3s in them these days as well. So if you're a vegetarian, there are some other ways, but you probably might want to be looking at supplements. And I'll mention the omega-3s that come from some plant sources like walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds. They do contain omega-3, but the source that you get from fish is a longer chain, chemical term, can't take the chemist out of me. So the omega-3s coming from fish, the EPA and the DHA, if you've heard those terms, is likely to be more beneficial than what you would get from the plant sources. And so then the other side of this equation of working this ratio is to decrease foods high in omega-6 fatty acids. And so this omega-6s are high in most vegetable oils that are common in the food supply. So this is things like corn oil, peanut oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil. And so if you use those, it's a relatively easy switch to switch those out for olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat. It's omega-9 typically. And so if that is an easy switch for you to switch out vegetable oil from your cooking for olive oil, that's a good one. But one of the big places to look for omega-6s is in the food supply and reading food labels. So if you eat a lot of processed foods, you might want to start looking and seeing if any of these vegetable oils appear there. And if you might be able to change out to some other food that has olive oil or some other food in general. So the challenge for both of the diets that I've talked about thus far is they can be difficult to follow. So the ketogenic diet is difficult because of the very low carbs. The high omega-3, high omega-6 can be difficult, especially if you're eating a lot of kind of pre-packaged, pre-prepared foods, and you don't necessarily have control over the types of oils that are going into those. So they can be difficult. But I don't want you to be discouraged, again, because we have evidence for these diets because they're so different from our typical eating patterns. When we're looking to demonstrate an effect, kind of using a scientific study, it's easier to start with something that is so much further from the norm or the typical diet and look for differences. And since the ketogenic diet is so different, we can detect differences pretty easily. It gets harder to study diets that are maybe less dramatic and show that they're having an impact. So we're learning again from these different research that have been going on, and we're getting there. But for these two diets, I would recommend seeking nutrition counseling from a dietitian if you're thinking, especially if you're thinking about the ketogenic diet, and kind of helping you get over that initial stage of adjustment and finding things and ways where the diet can work for you, or the eating pattern can work for you. As well as, to help preventing other deficiencies from following that diet. Let's see. So there's one more eating pattern that I'll mention, and I know I'm talking quite a bit. But so briefly then we can talk about, there's increasing evidence for a low glycemic diet. And what do I mean by a low glycemic diet? And so this is a diet that prioritizes foods that have a lesser impact on blood glucose. What do I mean by that? If this is a blood glucose curve, so we've got blood glucose on the y-axis, so this is how much glucose is circulating in your blood at any point. And then the time from eating a meal. So if they eat a meal here at 0 or eat some food here at 0, we follow how much glucose is in the blood, how long it takes the glucose in that food to reach the bloodstream. So if you drink a soda or pop, or some really sugary beverage at time 0, if you follow this the red curve is what it would look like when you consume soda or lots of sugar. And so what that means is it passes through your stomach, hits your small intestine, and gets absorbed into the bloodstream really quickly because there's not much digestion that's needed. And so after you drink that sugary beverage, your blood glucose goes up really high really quickly. Your pancreas realizes there's a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, secretes insulin, and then you start to see the blood glucose dropping as the glucose gets taken up into the cells of your body. Problem occurs when you pass, here what was your baseline glucose level. Maybe if your pancreas overcompensated, secreted a little too much insulin, your blood glucose can dip a little low here. And this is when you get kind of hungry, cranky, quickly after eating something really high in sugar. So that's a high glycemic index food. So what we like to see to avoid this phase where we get low blood glucose and cranky, and this is where we think we might get into trouble territory for migraines. So what we like to see instead is this low glycemic index. So prioritizing foods that have this effect, that take longer to digest, that take longer for the glucose to hit your bloodstream, and are sort of have a more gentle impact on your blood glucose level. So this is something like if you eat kidney beans or any, sort of canned beans, they've got carbs, but they've also got a lot of protein and a lot of fiber, and they take a long time to digest. So by the time they reach your intestine, they still have some digesting to do. So the glucose increase is gentle and the decrease is gentle. And so that's what we're targeting with this diet, is foods that help kind of keep your blood glucose increases and decreases gentle over time. There's increasing evidence for this, both in kind of basic mechanistic science, as well as a few RCTs, randomized controlled trials, that have shown lower headache days per month. Who might benefit? Generally, a low glycemic diet is what we recommend for everyone, even though we don't go out and say it, but the general health recommendations would be, approximately a low glycemic diet. So again, for general health, but especially folks with, if diabetes or overweight or metabolic syndrome, again, you're looking at some potential benefits of that blood glucose control. The studies thus far have been about 3 months in trying to demonstrate results for this. And what it looks like is foods that are lower in sugar, and foods that have carbs. You're looking at more complex carbohydrates, starches, fibers, whole grains, non-starchy veggies when you can, proteins, healthy fats, low sugar. And when you do eat carbohydrates, pairing them with fat or protein, which slows down the digestion and absorption process. One of the studies used personalized nutrition, and actually had people wear a continuous glucose monitor and tried to make predictions for their individual foods of how they responded to food. So that's exciting to see it on the market, or being studied. I look forward and hope that can be on the market too. So moving forward. So on a similar note, what should we know about skipping meals, which is related in some ways to blood glucose? We know meal skipping has been recognized as a trigger, anecdotally, for a long time, for both headaches and specifically for migraines. Objective evidence is building to recognize this in different study designs, observing that skipping breakfast was associated with migraines, nighttime snacking associated with reduced odds of migraine the next day. We see migraine attacks increase during the Ramadan fast, and we see hunger hormone shifts during fasting that correlate with our expectations of migraine. So continuing, we still don't know the full story though, because when we look, a more recent study during the month of Ramadan found migraines increased during the first 10 days of fasting Ramadan, so from sun up to sundown. And then the increase subsided. So there's no longer, more migraines the second 10 days and third 10 days of migraine if you divide the month up into 3 10-day segments. So it looked like there might be some adaptation happening, or at least no longer getting worse. And so that's something for us to keep looking into for more evidence. We also know that stress and time availability is often related to skipping meals. And so this is interesting because it's a question of, well, what is actually, the problem for the migraine? We certainly know that stress is a common trigger of migraine. And so is it actually the skipping of the meal, or is it the stress that led to a skipping of the meal, or possibly some combination of the two that is happening here? So, and then the other thing I will mention is that we still don't have a good time frame. So it's common to recommend to avoid fasting for too long of a period of time, to avoid skipping a meal as being a trigger for migraine, but we still don't have a specific time point or a number of hours to recommend for folks that is evidence-based. So the best I can say is being aware of your own hunger and satiety signals and cues in your body, and really trying to be mindful of that. So if you do practice mindfulness, which does have good evidence for migraine, maybe turning to your hunger cues and raising awareness of that, and your mindfulness practice might be something you might consider adding So we're starting to pull all of this together for blood glucose and eating patterns and glycemic index and meal skipping, but I think there's more coming. So stay tuned. And so I'll turn to food triggers briefly, and they are a controversial topic. And triggers in general in the migraine community are not uncontroversial. So this is my take on food triggers, and it is that, in my opinion, the evidence doesn't bear out for most food triggers or for diets designed to remove them as a intervention for migraine. There is increasing evidence to suggest that food cravings that occur during the prodromal phase of an attack, so food cravings occur before the pain phase hits, and so those cravings may be a symptom of the attack, as we see activation of certain parts of the brain related to hunger at that stage of the migraine. So it may be that these cravings cause us to eat a food that we then perceive as a trigger because we eat it right before the pain phase hits. So that's a developing area of research these days too. I would say the two that I think have the best evidence that bears out in the literature are caffeine and alcohol. To pay attention to those, we've got some good mechanistic evidence for those, but I do not want to minimize anyone's experience. I do believe there are more triggers out there. I don't think they're as common as we once believed them to be, because of some of this evidence that's coming out. And so because of that kind of combined, it's my opinion that the diets to remove triggers put an unnecessary burden on a lot of people with migraine. And so I don't recommend them kind of as a blanket statement. But I do think we are developing new research designs to study personalized triggers, and so, but it is difficult. So we're getting there, but this one I think will take a little while to sort out. But so I do recommend talking to your doctor about triggers if you want to try to investigate and see what they recommend and if they can help you with any of that. With regard to supplements, there is a pretty strong consensus in the migraine community about supplementation for some of them. And so I don't feel a need to dwell quite as much on some of the caveats here. And so I'll focus on maybe different ways of how we can help use these supplements most effectively. So the ones with the best evidence are magnesium in the range of 400 to 600 milligrams per day, riboflavin, coenzyme Q10, and feverfew, which is a botanical, a plant. And so the magnesium, this is a pretty high dose. And if you just start out at this dose, you may have some GI symptoms, you may have some diarrhea and some bloating, and that's a result of the magnesium not all getting absorbed and pooling water into your intestines. So if you've experienced that, it is self-limiting. It should stop with the dose that you took. So you can start to work your way up slowly. So start at maybe half of this dose and go up from there over a period of time. You could split it into multiple doses if that helps. And you could try different forms. Magnesium salts, supplements are a salt, just like table salt is sodium chloride. Magnesium, the most common magnesium salt is magnesium oxide, but that can have more symptoms. So I tend to recommend magnesium glycinate or magnesium citrate. They tend to be a little more expensive, but still they're more bioavailable, and so still recommended for migraine. For riboflavin, 400 milligrams a day is a relatively high dose, so you might have to search a little bit to find a supplement with that dose. And just be aware it does make your urine very dark yellow, bright dark yellow. And so if you track your urine as, the color of your urine as a way to check how hydrated you are, taking a riboflavin supplement will interfere with that a little bit. So just be aware of that. Coenzyme Q10, very safe. Also a relatively high dose compared to some of what's available on the market, at least here, and it tends to be more expensive. So my general perspective is to try the others first because of the cost of coenzyme Q10, but it is safe and effective. And then feverfew, again, as a botanical supplement, my recommendation here is to check with your doctor. As a botanical, any of the botanicals have more possibility of interacting with drugs. And so this is why it's especially important for, to check with your doctor, but check with them for any of these before you get started. And then jumping to the kind of the last question I was asked to cover, and this is how long do we need to follow a diet to see whether or not it helps? It depends. The research outcomes are for migraine are generally evaluated at 3 months. About 3 months is kind of what we see in the pharmaceutical studies. So that's what we've seen a lot of the dietary studies try to do too, is try the treatment for 3 months and see what happens. That doesn't mean it takes that full amount of time to see the effect, but that's when it can be measured. So that's the tricky part. So what I would encourage you to do if you are trying one of these interventions is to really, really pay attention to how you feel, especially for something like the low glycemic eating pattern, where if you're trying to adjust and make changes so that your blood sugar is more stable, and theoretically you'd also feel less hungry and less cranky if you're not eating those really not having those really high glucose blood sugar and really low glucose blood sugar. Okay. And so you might feel a difference. You might just feel better. And so really pay attention. Am I as hungry? Am I, do I need to eat as often? Things of that nature. So you might not have to wait the full 3 months to start to feel something if you really start to kind of pay attention to these little things along the way. So wrapping up, my overall recommendations for everyone, these are the general dietary guidelines. So following a generally healthy diet that includes lots of non-starchy vegetables, a range of overall fruits and vegetables, limiting those ultra-processed packaged chips and crisps and cookies and crackers, anything with lots of sugar and solid fat in it, choosing whole grains whenever possible, and prioritizing these unsweetened beverages. And if you're doing that, then you're already probably following a diet that meets that low glycemic criteria, or well on your way. And that eating pattern is already beneficial for some of the conditions that are comorbid or co-occur with migraine, like diabetes and heart disease and obesity. So I think that's kind of my baseline recommendation for a lot of folks. If you're feeling you want to try a little more and you want to think about avoiding skipping meals and avoiding extended fasts, pay attention to the timing of your meals as well. Consider small, frequent meals and try to eat those carbs paired with proteins or fat, so that it does slow down how the glucose reaches your bloodstream. And then if you want to try an even bigger challenge, try to moderate the intake of omega-3 and omega-6 by eating fish twice a week, which is our recommendation here in the States. You can make olive oil your default cooking oil, and then try to limit those processed foods with vegetable oils in them. So if you can see a dietitian, great. I highly recommend it. If you can't, setting some SMART goals for yourself might be a way to start to approach this in kind of an easier way. And this is a recommendation. You choose 1 or 2 things at a time to focus on, and the SMART goals, you can search online for how to set SMART goals. They're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And so this is, during the next 2 weeks, every time I cook, I will convert any recipes that use vegetable oil to use olive oil instead, if possible. Or if you don't cook as much, during the next two weeks, I will look for and purchase products made with olive oil instead of vegetable oil at the store or restaurant. And this gives you, something discrete that you can focus on one at a time and make these changes. And then it gives you a time point at the end to say, after 2 weeks, how am I doing? Have I got this? Can I find something else to work on, or do I still need to continue working on this goal? So just one approach to kind of try to make these dietary changes a little more digestible, to use a nutrition pun. So, and then for those who want to do more, for those who want to try more, the ketogenic diet is certainly reasonable. As it's something to try for migraine, as well as focusing more on the specific study objectives for the high omega-3, low omega-6. And just for reference, they were looking at 1.5 grams of omega-3 per day and down to 2% of energy from omega-6. And just for reference, that's about 1/4 of the intake we in the States usually get for omega-6. So it was a pretty dramatic cut in omega-6. So if you really want to focus on that, you can definitely talk with a dietitian if you're trying to do kind of those changes for either. And then discuss triggers with your healthcare provider, and certainly you can discuss supplements with them as well. So wrapping up, I do believe there are significant reasons to be optimistic. We're getting closer to more complete answers for nutrition and migraine. And while there's still a lot of research to do, I do think we're starting to get the evidence that we can balance that burden with evidence and make recommendations to hopefully help improve migraine over a longer time. So, and dietitians can help implement these diets. So that took a little longer. I'm sorry to talk for so long, but I hope maybe I can help with some questions.